On a gray morning in 1994, the wind howled through a dusty attic, stirring decades of silence. An elderly man, the grandson of a soldier who had fought at Iwo Jima, was going through old family belongings when he found a wooden box, sealed shut for half a century. Inside, beneath rusted medals and faded photographs, was a yellowed envelope sealed with cracked red wax. In the upper corner, a name seemed to whisper through time: William Carter. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. The opening lines were ordinary: memories, farewells, the reflections of a young man on the brink of war. But as he kept reading, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew firm, urgent. Dates that had not yet come to pass. Place names that meant nothing in 1944, but that would later become etched in history. It was as if William hadn't written the letter for his own time, but for someone in the future. At the end of the letter, one sentence was underlined with force: "If they ignore the signs, another war will come. Not here, not now, but it will come." The envelope had been hidden inside a false wall and was discovered only because the house was about to be demolished. When the attic fell silent again, it felt as though the letter itself had been waiting, patiently, for this moment. Unsure of what he had found, the grandson brought the letter to a local historian who specialized in World War II records. The historian examined the paper and handwriting, then began to cross-check the cryptic names and references William had written. What he discovered was astonishing: direct connections to events that would take place years after 1944. The letter was no longer just a family keepsake. It had become a loose thread in the fabric of history. This is the story of a young American soldier who, just days before one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, wrote a letter that would echo through time. Decades later, his words would raise a chilling question. How could a man in 1944 describe the next conflict with such precision? Letters written during times of war carry more than ink on paper. They hold fears, confessions, hopes, and sometimes secrets that only time can reveal. In 1944, amid the brutal Battle of Iwo Jima, a young American soldier named William Carter wrote his final letter. Sealed with red wax and sent home, it would remain unread for 50 years. When it was finally opened, it revealed more than a farewell. It uncovered something no one expected to find. Time had turned that letter into a distant echo, a testimony from a man who seemed to see beyond his own moment in history. While most soldiers wrote about longing, fear, or courage, William's words carried an almost prophetic tone. He didn't just describe the present. He spoke of future events with unsettling accuracy. In this video, we'll revisit that moment in history. We'll return to 1944, to the darkness of Iwo Jima's trenches, and follow how a forgotten letter resurfaced decades later, changing the way many viewed both the past and what was yet to come. Before we begin, if you enjoy hidden stories, forgotten diaries, and letters that reveal long-buried secrets, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Leave a like to help more people discover these stories. And tell us in the comments, from which country and city are you watching this video? We love to see how far these echoes travel. Take a deep breath. Let's return to 1944. This is the story of William Carter's final letter. The Pacific in 1944 was no place for hesitation. Every day, American troops drew closer to the Japanese mainland, island by island, trench by trench. Rumors spread quickly through the ranks, whispers of a battle that would surpass all previous horrors. The name Iwo Jima began to circulate long before most soldiers even saw it on a map. William Carter was a 23-year-old Marine from Illinois. He wasn't extraordinary, just one of many young men swept into the tide of war. He carried a small notebook in his uniform, where he wrote down fragments of thoughts between deployments. According to his unit, William was quiet, observant, and always scribbling something when the others tried to sleep. The island itself was unlike any battlefield they had seen before. From afar, Iwo Jima looked like a black mass rising out of the ocean. Its volcanic sand swallowed boots whole, and the air smelled of sulfur and salt. Soldiers joked that even the ground seemed to resist their presence. But behind those jokes lay a growing, unspoken dread. Letters from the Pacific often spoke of heat, mud, and exhaustion. But William's letters were different. He didn't describe the chaos around him so much as he described what felt inevitable. There was something about the way he observed things, almost as if he were documenting not only what he saw, but what he sensed was coming. In one entry from his notebook dated just weeks before the landing, William wrote, "This island doesn't feel empty. At night, it breathes." Those words were passed off as poetic at the time, but decades later, when historians read them in context, they felt less like metaphors and more like premonitions. As the operation approached, morale fluctuated between nervous energy and forced bravado. Commanders briefed the men in clipped tones, emphasizing discipline and timing. The men, meanwhile, tried to hold on to scraps of normalcy, letters from home, cigarettes, or simply counting the days until their next assignment. William seemed distant. He spent nights staring out toward the dark horizon, as if expecting something to emerge from it. A fellow Marine later recalled that he once said, almost in a whisper, "It's not the enemy I'm afraid of. It's the silence before they arrive." No one paid much attention to his words at the time. War made men say strange things. But what William would soon write down, what he would send home, would later make even seasoned historians pause. His letter wasn't the desperate farewell of a soldier facing death. It was the composed testimony of someone who seemed to know more than he should. In the weeks leading up to the landing, his notebook entries became sharper, more precise. Names, dates, and cryptic phrases appeared without explanation. He never shared their meaning with anyone. Some of his fellow Marines thought he was simply keeping his mind busy to cope with the fear. But as history would show, those quiet nights on the edge of the Pacific weren't just moments of reflection. They were the beginning of something far more unsettling, a story that would remain hidden for 50 years until one letter emerged from the shadows. The days leading up to the assault on Iwo Jima were marked by an almost unbearable stillness. The sea seemed calmer than usual, the air unnaturally heavy. Soldiers tried to keep busy, but beneath every forced laugh and casual conversation was a shared understanding. Something was coming, something none of them could fully name. For William Carter, that silence was louder than any gunfire. In his notebook, he described it as a pause too long to be natural. At night, he would sit alone on the deck of the transport ship, staring at the black horizon as if listening for a distant signal. His fellow Marines often teased him for being too serious, but they admitted in hushed tones that the quiet was getting to them too. Commanders briefed the troops repeatedly, drilling procedures into their heads. Maps were unfolded, landing points marked, orders barked with precision. But no matter how many times they heard the plan, an invisible weight hung over them. It wasn't fear of the known, it was fear of what wasn't being said. In one of his final notebook entries before the landing, William wrote, "The ocean doesn't sleep, it's waiting." Decades later, historians would revisit this line and wonder whether he was merely being poetic, or if he had sensed something beyond what ordinary soldiers could perceive. On February 19, 1945, the stillness shattered. The landing crafts roared toward the beaches, their engines cutting through the fog like growling beasts. William gripped his rifle tightly, the letter to his sister tucked inside his jacket. Around him, men recited prayers, stared blankly, or forced nervous smiles. The silence had ended. What came next would be remembered for generations. The volcanic sand swallowed their boots, slowing their advance. Gunfire erupted from hidden positions, the air filled with the crack of bullets and the thud of mortars. William moved forward mechanically, like everyone else, because hesitation meant death. His thoughts, however, weren't on the battlefield. They were on the letter pressed against his chest. That night, after hours of chaos, William found a moment of solitude behind a shattered embankment. He pulled out his notebook and began to write with unusual intensity, not about the horrors he'd just witnessed, but about patterns, about places he'd heard mentioned in hushed voices, about dates he couldn't shake from his mind. Other Marines slept or cleaned their weapons. William kept writing. He described feelings he couldn't explain and events he felt were already set in motion. To anyone else, it might have seemed like the ramblings of a tired soldier. But the clarity of his words suggested something deeper, a man recording what he believed was inevitable. As the nights went on, the sounds of distant fighting blended with the wind. William grew quieter. His fellow Marines later recalled that he seemed somewhere else, as if his body was in Iwo Jima, but his mind had already moved far beyond the island. No one could have guessed that, tucked inside his uniform, William carried not just a farewell letter, but a message that would resurface half a century later, changing the way his family, and eventually historians, looked at the war. The silence that once surrounded him was about to find its voice. The battle for Iwo Jima intensified with each passing day. The island's black volcanic soil turned into a graveyard for soldiers from both sides. Smoke hung over the beaches like a permanent storm cloud, and the sound of artillery was so constant that silence itself began to feel unnatural. For many, the fight was purely about survival. But for William Carter, something else was unfolding, quietly between lines of ink. At night, after brutal skirmishes, he would retreat to a corner of the camp with his notebook and the letter he was writing to his sister Margaret. By the dim light of a lantern, he filled page after page with thoughts that were neither purely personal nor entirely military. His words carried a weight that even he seemed to struggle to contain. One fellow Marine remembered passing by William one night and seeing him write furiously, then stop, look at the sky, and whisper, "This isn't just a letter." At the time, nobody understood what he meant. They assumed the war was wearing him down. But in retrospect, that sentence would echo like a riddle finally understood decades later. William began to record names of places he'd never visited: Korea, Havana, Saigon. He jotted down years that hadn't yet arrived. His handwriting shifted from steady to hurried, as if he was racing against time. It wasn't the tone of a man speculating. It read like someone trying to document facts before they slipped away. Between military instructions and poetic observations, cryptic phrases appeared in the margins. The next war won't begin with a gunshot. They won't see it coming. Listen to the echoes. They change shape, not volume. For a young Marine on a remote island in 1944, these were not typical musings. The fighting grew bloodier. The terrain, already unforgiving, turned into a labyrinth of bunkers and traps. Casualties mounted. William's unit suffered heavy losses. Yet through it all, he continued to write. Even when his hands were bandaged from shrapnel cuts, he held the pen with the same determination he held his rifle. One evening, under a blood-red sunset, William sealed the letter to Margaret. He pressed the wax firmly, as if locking away something far bigger than a soldier's farewell. Witnesses recalled how unusually calm he looked afterward, like a man who had finished something that mattered deeply. In his notebook, the final entry before sealing the letter was brief. "If they open this in the wrong time, they won't understand. But if they open it in the right time, they'll know." It wasn't the kind of message anyone expected from a young man surrounded by chaos. It felt deliberate, as if written with an unseen audience in mind. That night, artillery fire rained over their position. Many didn't survive until dawn. William was last seen moving toward the front lines with his unit, his letter tucked safely inside his jacket. In the chaos of war, no one noticed when he disappeared. For the military, William Carter became just another missing soldier, his fate filed away in official reports. But his words, sealed in wax, survived. Long after the gunfire ceased and the island fell silent, the ink he left behind would continue to speak. The final days of the battle were brutal. The air over Iwo Jima was thick with smoke and gunpowder, and the island itself seemed to tremble under the weight of endless bombardment. Soldiers described it as living inside a storm that never stopped. For many, reality blurred into a cycle of gunfire, exhaustion, and fear. For William Carter, those days became the last entries in a story that wouldn't be fully understood until half a century later. Reports from his unit indicate that William was last seen near the eastern ridge, moving with a small group of Marines during an early morning push. The fog was so dense that visibility dropped to a few feet. Enemy fire erupted from hidden bunkers, forcing the men to scatter. In the chaos, William was separated from his squad. Several soldiers later claimed to have heard him shouting orders, trying to regroup. Others swore they saw him dragging a wounded comrade toward cover. But after that moment, William Carter simply disappeared into the smoke. His name would later be added to the long list of men marked missing in action. The letter he had written to his sister was eventually collected among the personal effects recovered by the military. Like thousands of other letters, it was sent home without explanation. its significance hidden within sealed wax and folded pages. Margaret Carter received it a few weeks later. At the time, the letter seemed like nothing more than a final goodbye. She couldn't bring herself to break the seal. She placed it inside a small wooden box, along with his photographs, medals, and childhood keepsakes. The box was stored away in the attic, forgotten, like so many memories of that era. The war ended, the world changed, and decades passed. Margaret grew older, moving from house to house, always keeping the box but never opening the letter. Some said she didn't want to face the pain. Others believed she was honoring his words. He had once told her, before leaving, that some things are meant to be read at the right time. Meanwhile, William's name faded into the background of military archives. He became one of many young men lost to the chaos of war. Historians who later studied his unit's records noted nothing unusual, no classified missions, no special assignments. Just another Marine who disappeared during one of the fiercest battles of the Pacific. But what no one knew was that inside that forgotten attic, a letter was quietly waiting. Unopened, untouched, preserved by accident, or perhaps by fate. It would remain there for 50 years, until a demolition order turned memory into discovery. The letter's journey mirrored the man who wrote it, vanishing into the fog of war, only to reappear decades later with questions no one expected to ask. The silence that had once surrounded William's words was nearing its end. In that attic, between dust and shadows, history had been patiently waiting, and when the seal was finally broken, it wouldn't just be a family that heard William's voice, it would be the world. The letter didn't resurface in some distant government vault. It was found in a family attic. For 50 years, it had been hidden behind a false wall, wrapped in brittle paper and blanketed by time. When William Carter's grandson discovered it in 1994, he couldn't have imagined that those fragile pages would spark a historical investigation and a mystery that would echo far beyond his family. At first, the discovery was intimate. The grandson sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by relatives, and began to read aloud. But halfway through, the tone of the letter shifted. Dates that didn't belong to 1944. Names that seemed meaningless to the older generation but immediately stood out to the younger ones. Names tied to events they had studied in history classes. Intrigued and unsettled, the grandson contacted a local historian who specialized in World War II records. The historian approached the letter as a document, not a family relic. He examined the paper, the ink, the wax seal, and compared the handwriting. Everything pointed to authenticity. The letter was written in 1944, untouched since. But when he began cross-referencing the references William had included, place names, cryptic notes, strange dates, his curiosity turned to astonishment. The list didn't match any operational plans from 1944. Instead, the references corresponded to political flashpoints and conflicts that would erupt in the decades after the war: Korea, Cuba, Vietnam. Each one was noted with eerie precision. Historians could dismiss one or two coincidences, but not a pattern this deliberate. The historian tracked down Margaret Carter, William's sister, who was living alone in Illinois. She had kept the letter sealed all those years. When it was placed in her hands again, the room seemed to tighten around her. Her voice trembled as she read passages aloud, passages that spoke of echoes that change shape, not volume, and wars that come dressed as peace. The specificity was unnerving. Word spread quickly among local scholars and veteran groups. Some called the letter prophetic. Others claimed it was a statistical fluke. But the more experts examined it, the harder it became to explain away. The language wasn't vague or poetic. It read like observation, not speculation. Newspaper articles followed. Historians debated publicly. Could a young Marine in 1944 have pieced together information that even military intelligence overlooked? Some believed William might have overheard strategic conversations. Others suggested an extraordinary intuition sharpened by war. None could explain it fully. Eventually, to preserve it properly, the family donated the original letter to a regional historical archive. Conservators stabilized the fragile paper, and researchers documented every detail. The letter became available to vetted historians, who began studying its references like puzzle pieces scattered across decades. Patterns emerged. Researchers discovered that some of William's notes mirrored obscure communications that had circulated at lower levels of command, signals and whispers that never made it into official records. One historian proposed that William, perhaps unknowingly, absorbed fragments of future conflicts and stitched them together through his observations. Whatever the explanation, the fact remained. A letter written in the chaos of Iwo Jima had survived long enough to speak in a different era. Found by a grandson, examined by historians, and preserved behind glass, William Carter's words continue to ask questions that history has yet to answer. His voice didn't fade with the gunfire. It simply waited. 50 years separate a silent night on Iwo Jima from the moment William Carter's words were finally read aloud in a quiet living room in Illinois. Time, relentless and impartial, hadn't erased his voice. It had only hidden it, waiting for the right moment to resurface. This was no ordinary letter. It was a message that crossed oceans, generations, and the boundaries of war. While experts still debate whether William's words were intuition, coincidence, or something far more complex, one thing is certain: the letter is real. The paper, the ink, the wax seal, unchanged since 1944. His tone, calm yet unsettling, suggested a man who had already accepted his fate, and perhaps glimpsed a future that others couldn't see. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a strategist. He was simply a young Marine who left behind a voice that refused to disappear. What did William Carter truly know? How could one man surrounded by chaos and moments from death write with such striking clarity about events still decades away? The letter remains under glass, but its words continue to echo, not just in archives, but in the minds of all who read them. Some messages don't fade, they wait.